The Carithian dreadnought Infinite Dominion hung in the void like a predator made of midnight and malice. Its hull stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with weapons that could reduce planets to ash. Inside its cavernous engineering bay, surrounded by technology he barely understood, Marcus Chen wiped grease from his hands and tried not to think about how he'd ended up here. 6 months ago, he'd been fixing agricultural haulers on Proxima Station. Then the Carithians came, and humanity learned it wasn't alone in the universe. The lesson came with plasma fire and surrender terms. "Human slave technician," barked Overseer Vralkesh, his translator mangling the clicking language into something Marcus's ears could process. The Carithian stood nearly 8 feet tall, his exoskeleton gleaming like polished obsidian. "The primary drive coupling fails again. Your species built the original component we salvaged. You will repair it." Marcus nodded, keeping his eyes down. He'd learned that much in captivity. Never meet their eyes, never show defiance. The Carithians had conquered 17 species before humanity. They knew how to break spirits, but they didn't know everything. The drive coupling wasn't actually failing. Marcus had made sure of that 3 weeks ago when he'd carefully recalibrated the feedback sensors to report errors that didn't exist. It was a gamble, but the Carithians treated their human technicians like living tools. Useful but beneath contempt. They never double-checked his work. He descended into the ship's mechanical heart, where massive conduits channeled enough power to fold space itself. The Infinite Dominion was the flagship of the fleet currently preparing to assault Earth. Marcus had heard the crew discussing it, not bothering to lower their voices around the human. They'd hit his homeworld in 72 hours. Unless he could stop them. The Carithians were brilliant warriors and strategists, but they had a fatal flaw: arrogance. They'd conquered so many species that they'd stopped expecting resistance from those they deemed inferior. Their ships were wonders of engineering, but they'd grown lazy, relying on salvage technology they didn't fully understand, and slave labor to maintain it. Marcus pulled out his toolkit, primitive by Carithian standards, but these were human tools, and he understood them perfectly. He began the repair, fingers moving with practiced precision. To any observer, he was simply replacing a malfunctioning component. In reality, he was carefully rewiring the dreadnought's weapon targeting system. The Carithians had centralized everything. Every gun, every missile, every plasma lance on the ship ran through a single tactical network. It made coordination seamless, but it also created a vulnerability, one that Marcus had spent 6 months studying, probing, understanding. He worked for 3 hours, sweat dripping despite the cool air. His modifications were subtle, buried deep in the system architecture where no one would think to look. He rerouted targeting protocols, inserted delay loops, and created backdoor access points keyed to specific input sequences. When he finished, the weapon systems would still function normally, until he activated his changes. "Human," Vralkesh's voice echoed through the bay. "Status. Coupling repaired, Overseer," Marcus called back, climbing out of the access shaft. "Running diagnostics now." The display showed green across the board. Vralkesh examined them with his triple-jointed fingers, then dismissed Marcus with a gesture. The human bowed and retreated to his small quarters, just another insignificant slave finishing another insignificant task. But Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the darkness, counting down the hours. 72 hours became 48. Then 24. The fleet assembled, over 100 warships preparing to jump to Earth's system. Marcus could feel the anticipation thrumming through the Infinite Dominion. The Carithians were eager for another conquest. At hour 0, the fleet jumped. Reality twisted as space folded around them. When it snapped back, Earth hung before them, blue and green and utterly defenseless. Humanity's hastily assembled defense fleet, barely 40 ships strong, formed a desperate line. "All vessels," Commander Thraktal's voice boomed across the fleet channel. "Begin the assault. Let us show these primitives the price of resistance." The Carithian fleet opened fire as one, except the Infinite Dominion. Marcus had waited until the moment of maximum chaos. His fingers flew across the stolen datapad he'd hidden for months, entering the activation sequence he'd memorized. Deep in the ship's systems, his modifications awakened. The dreadnought's weapons swiveled, targeting matrices recalculating. Warning klaxons shrieked as the crew realized something was catastrophically wrong. But by then it was too late. The Infinite Dominion opened fire on its own fleet. 3 kilometers of dreadnought fury, designed to break planets turned against ships that had no shields raised, no evasive maneuvers planned. The closest cruiser exploded before its captain could even scream. Plasma lances scythed through destroyer wings like a farmer cutting wheat. "What is happening?" Thraktal roared. "Vralkesh, regain control of your vessel." But Vralkesh was already dead, incinerated when Marcus's backdoor had vented the command deck's atmosphere. The human had included that as a personal touch. Marcus ran through the corridors as the ship tore itself apart around him. Carithian crew members rushed past trying to reach their stations, too panicked to notice one human slave moving with purpose. He made it to the escape pod bay, where he'd hidden an extra suit months ago. Behind him, the Infinite Dominion continued its rampage. Marcus's programming was elegant in its simplicity. Prioritize targets based on threat level and proximity, ignore all shutdown commands, and keep firing until the capacitors burned out. The dreadnought wouldn't stop until it was destroyed or its weapons were slag. Either way, the Carithian fleet was in chaos. As Marcus's escape pod launched toward the human defense line, he watched through the viewport. The Infinite Dominion was burning now, focus fire from a dozen ships finally overwhelming its shields. But it had taken 17 Carithian vessels with it, and the remainder of the fleet was in disarray, formation broken, unable to coordinate. The human fleet, outnumbered but no longer outgunned, pressed their advantage. Marcus Chen, just a mechanic from Proxima Station, had turned the tide of the war. Not with weapons or strategy, but with patience, observation, and the simple understanding that every complex system has a weakness. The Carithians had treated him like a tool. He'd simply proven them right, just not in the way they'd expected. As Earth Command picked up his pod and the broken Carithian fleet retreated in disarray, Marcus allowed himself a small smile. He'd been just a mechanic, but humanity had always been good at making do with what they had. And sometimes a wrench was just as mighty as a warship.